Growing up as a kid, I never dreamed any of this would come true. All I ever wanted was to have just maybe one hit record.
In the glittering rise of American pop music, few voices cut through the noise like that unmistakable falsetto that seemed to float above the chaos of the 1960s, a sound both fragile and unbreakable. And now, at 91 years old, Frankie Valli stands as a living echo of an era that refuses to settle neatly into history, because the story of the Four Seasons was never just about chart-topping hits, sold-out theaters, or synchronized suits under bright stage lights. It was a narrative, stitched together with ambition, loyalty, betrayal, survival, and mysteries that even decades later feel unresolved, as if every harmony concealed another untold truth, every applause masked a disagreement, and every success raised more questions than answers. The neighborhoods that shaped the group were tough, unforgiving places where dreams of stardom clashed with the realities of working-class struggle, and the early years were less about glamour and more about persistence, failed auditions, revolving lineups, and a determination that bordered on obsession. Because for Valli and his bandmates, music wasn't just an escape. It was the only path forward, the only chance to outrun the limitations of their surroundings. Yet as the group's fame exploded, propelled by hit after hit that seemed to define a generation, cracks began to form beneath the polished surface, and the mythology of brotherhood started to unravel, revealing tensions over money, creative control, and personal loyalties that blurred the line between friendship and business. Behind the scenes, deals were made, debts accumulated, and responsibilities shifted, leaving fans to wonder how a group that sounded so unified could experience such deep internal divisions. And even today, historians and enthusiasts still debate who truly held the reins, who sacrificed the most, and who walked away with more than their share. The paradox is striking. The smoother the harmonies became, the more complicated the reality grew, as if the perfection of their sound demanded a personal cost that no one fully understood at the time. Fame intensified everything. The touring schedules that drained energy, the pressures to keep producing hits, the industry expectations that demanded reinvention. And Valli's voice, soaring and youthful, became both a blessing and a burden, because while audiences heard effortless magic, the man behind the microphone endured physical strain, emotional exhaustion, and the weight of keeping the brand alive even as circumstances changed. Stories of disagreements, financial complications, and shifting alliances continued to surface over the years, sometimes contradicting each other, sometimes confirming suspicions that the group's internal dynamics were never as harmonious as their music suggested. And still, through lineup changes, personal tragedies, and decades of evolving musical trends, Valli remained a constant, the thread connecting past to present, performing long after many of his contemporaries had faded away, his presence raising yet another question. Was a legacy truly collective, or had it always revolved around one voice? The longevity itself complicates the narrative, because survival often reshapes history, and as memories blur, different versions of events emerge, each participant recalling moments in ways that serve their own perspective, leaving observers to piece together a puzzle that never quite locks into place. The Four Seasons story includes triumphs that seem almost cinematic, but also losses that cut deeply, personal hardships, family struggles, and moments when success felt overshadowed by grief, reminding us that behind the polished image were individuals navigating real lives, not just performers stepping into the spotlight. The public saw the smiles, the crisp suits, the polished choreography, but rarely glimpsed the negotiations, the arguments, the uncertainties that defined the journey behind closed doors. Over time, nostalgia transformed the group into legends, and adaptations retold their rise with dramatic flair. Yet even those retellings sparked debate, because each interpretation highlighted certain truths while leaving others in shadow, fueling the sense of the complete story remained just out of reach. Now, with Valli in his 90s, continuing to perform and embody a living connection to that golden era, the questions linger more than ever, not as accusations but as curiosities, as if the music itself invites listeners to look deeper, to ask whether the harmonies masked unresolved tensions, whether the success was shared equally, whether the sacrifices were understood. Perhaps the enduring mystery is part of the appeal, because legends often thrive on ambiguity, and the uncertainty surrounding the Four Seasons only amplifies their cultural footprint, turning their history into something more than a timeline, a narrative filled with contradictions, resilience, and unanswered questions. As audiences revisit those timeless songs, they hear not just melodies but echoes of ambition, rivalry, loyalty, and survival, a reminder that behind every polished performance lies a human story far more complex than the spotlight reveals. And as long as Frankie Valli's voice continues to resonate, whether live on stage or preserved in recordings, the debate will continue, the puzzle will remain incomplete, and the story of the four seasons will endure as one of music's most fascinating enigmas, a tale where harmony and mystery coexist, leaving listeners captivated, reflective, and still searching for answers. And as the years stretch further from the moment those first harmonies captivated radio waves, the narrative surrounding Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons becomes less like a clean biography and more like a layered documentary where each revelation leads to another unanswered question, because the deeper one looks, the more contradictions appear, and the more the story feels unfinished. There were moments when success seemed unstoppable, when every new release climbed charts and cemented their influence. Yet behind that steady ascent were whispers of disagreements over contracts, ownership, and the direction of the group, whispers that grew louder as the music industry itself evolved and forced artists to adapt or risk fading into obscurity. The public saw a group united by sound, but insiders described a structure that shifted constantly, with members coming and going, responsibilities redistributed, and financial burdens that sometimes fell unevenly, creating tensions that lingered long after the applause faded. It's a kind of story where loyalty and practicality collided, where personal bonds were tested by professional survival, and where decisions made in small offices would echo across decades of legacy. Frankie Valli, meanwhile, remained at the center, not just as a singer but as a symbol, carrying the expectations of fans who believed the voice represented the group itself, even as the people behind that voice changed over time. That dynamic raises another layer of intrigue. Was the identity of the Four Seasons ever truly fixed, or was it constantly evolving around the one element that never changed? As years passed, new musicians stepped into roles once filled by original members, and while the sound continued, the question of authenticity quietly followed, challenging the idea of what it meant to preserve a legacy. At the same time, personal hardships added depth to the narrative, tragedies that unfolded away from the spotlight yet shaped the emotional landscape of those involved, reminding observers that fame doesn't shield anyone from loss, and sometimes the brightest stages cast the darkest shadows. Fans often imagined success as a smooth ride, but the reality was far more complicated, filled with financial setbacks, legal entanglements, and moments when the future of the group seemed uncertain. Even as nostalgia revived interest and introduced the music to new generations, debates resurfaced about how events were portrayed, who was credited, and whether the simplified retellings captured the full truth. Every interview added another piece, yet none completed the puzzle, leaving historians to sift through memories that sometimes conflicted, sometimes overlapped, and sometimes revealed entirely new angles. The passage of time adds urgency to these questions, because with each passing year, the number of first-hand voices diminishes, and the opportunity to clarify fades, turning speculation into part of the legend itself. And still, Frankie Valli continues to perform, defying expectations, embodying resilience that mirrors the endurance of the songs themselves, yet also prompting curiosity about how much of the past remains unresolved even for those who lived it. Audiences watch, listen, and wonder, not just about the music, but about the untold negotiations, the silent compromises, the moments when the harmony nearly fractured beyond repair. The Four Seasons journey becomes more than a timeline of hits. It becomes a study in ambition, endurance, and the complicated nature of collaboration, where success doesn't erase conflict but often amplifies it. As long as the falsetto echoes through speakers and concert halls, the story continues to invite questions, encouraging viewers to look beyond nostalgia and examine the human drama beneath the polished image. In that sense, the mystery is not a flaw but a defining feature, a reminder that some legends remain powerful precisely because they resist simple explanations, and as Frankie Valli stands at 9-1, still connected to a past that refuses to settle, the story remains open-ended, compelling, and unresolved, urging audiences to keep listening closely, because somewhere between the harmonies and the silence, the truth is still waiting to be fully heard, and perhaps what makes this story even more compelling is the way time has transformed certainty into speculation, turning once clear memories into fragments that no longer align perfectly, as if the past itself is shifting with every retelling, and the deeper historians and fans dig, the more the narrative seems to blur rather than sharpen. There were defining moments that appeared straightforward on the surface, a breakthrough performance, a contract signed, a sudden lineup change, Yet each of these milestones carries multiple interpretations, depending on who tells the story and when it's told. Some recall loyalty that held the group together through impossible odds, while others hint at quiet resentments that simmered beneath the surface, never fully addressed but never completely disappearing either. The success of the Four Seasons didn't just elevate careers. It created pressure, expectations that demanded consistency in an industry that thrived on change, forcing decisions that sometimes prioritized survival over sentiment. Frankie Valli's voice, still astonishingly recognizable after decades, became more than a musical instrument. It became a brand, a legacy, a symbol that audiences associated with authenticity, even as the structure behind that symbol continued to evolve. That tension between continuity and change is at the heart of why the story still doesn't add up, because while the sound remained familiar, the circumstances surrounding it were anything but stable. There were financial risks taken, partnerships tested, and moments when the future seemed uncertain despite past triumphs, illustrating how fragile success can be even at its peak. Over the years, nostalgia revived the group's popularity again and again, introducing their music to audiences who weren't even born when the hits first dominated radio. Yet each revival brought renewed scrutiny, renewed questions, and renewed debate about what truly happened behind the scenes. Interviews conducted decades apart sometimes contradicted early accounts, not necessarily out of deception, but because memory itself changes, reshaping events through the lens of time, experience, and personal perspective. And still, Frankie Valli remains on stage, a living bridge between myth and reality, performing songs that feel frozen in youth while he himself represents the passage of time, a contrast that deepens a sense of mystery rather than resolving it. The applause continues, the melodies endure, but the unanswered questions linger, creating a narrative that feels unfinished, almost intentionally incomplete. Perhaps that's why the story resonates so strongly, because it mirrors the complexity of real life, where relationships evolve, motives overlap, and truth rarely exists in a single version. As audiences listen closely, they don't just hear harmony. They sense the weight of ambition, the cost of endurance, and the quiet uncertainty that has followed the Four Seasons from their earliest days to the present. At 9-1, Frankie Valli doesn't just represent longevity. He represents a puzzle still being assembled, a history still debated, and a legacy that refuses to settle into a simple conclusion. And maybe that's the most powerful part of all, that even after decades of music, fame, and storytelling, the final note hasn't been played, the final answer hasn't been given, and somewhere within those timeless harmonies, the truth continues to echo, inviting listeners to lean in, question more deeply, and realize that some stories remain unforgettable precisely because they never fully resolve. What complicates a legend even further is the way the passage of generations has turned the Four Seasons journey into something almost mythological, where facts and interpretations blend together until it becomes difficult to separate what truly happened from what has been polished by nostalgia, because every decade seems to add another layer to the narrative rather than clarifying it. The early days were fueled by hunger and determination, but success introduced new variables, management decisions, evolving contracts, and the constant pressure to remain relevant, all of which created a landscape where unity was both essential and fragile. Frankie Valli's voice remained the anchor, soaring above changing musical trends. Yet the machinery behind that sound required constant negotiation, and those negotiations weren't always smooth. Some accounts describe sacrifices made quietly to keep the group afloat, while others hint at disagreements that shaped careers in ways fans never fully understood. And these contrasting viewpoints leave the story feeling incomplete, like pages missing from a crucial chapter. The idea of brotherhood, so often associated with vocal groups, becomes more complicated when viewed through decades of business realities, where loyalty had to coexist with survival, and personal relationships were tested by financial pressures and artistic ambitions. As the music industry shifted, the group adapted, sometimes successfully, sometimes with difficulty, and each transition added another question: who truly guided the direction, and who followed reluctantly? Even the concept of identity becomes blurred, because the Four Seasons, at different points in time, meant different combinations of people. Yet audiences continue to connect the name primarily with one voice, reinforcing the notion that the legacy had always revolved around a singular presence. That perception may have strengthened the brand, but it also deepened the mystery surrounding contributions, credit, and the balance of recognition. Meanwhile, time moved forward relentlessly, bringing personal losses, changing priorities, and the natural evolution of lives lived largely in public view. And still, through it all, Valli continued performing, his endurance both inspiring and puzzling, prompting observers to wonder how much of the past remained unresolved even in his own reflections. The story becomes less about definitive answers and more about the coexistence of multiple truths, each shaped by perspective and memory. Fans who revisit the music today don't just hear harmonies. They sense the weight of decades, the ambition that fueled the rise, the tension that accompanied success, and the resilience that allowed the legacy to survive. At 91, Frankie Valli stands as a living reminder that history isn't always tidy, that legends are often built on complexities, and that some stories remain compelling precisely because they resist a final explanation. The Four Seasons journey continues to echo through time, not as a closed chapter, but as an ongoing conversation, one where every note carries both celebration and curiosity, and where the question of what really happened remains part of the music itself, lingering in the silence between the harmonies, waiting to be explored again and again. And as the spotlight of history continues to shift, the story surrounding Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons begins to feel less like a biography and more like an unfolding investigation, where every detail invites a closer look and every recollection opens a door to another possibility. The rise was undeniable, a string of hits that seemed to define youthful optimism. Yet beneath that optimism were decisions made under pressure, moments when the path forward required compromises that would later become sources of debate. Success brought visibility, but it also magnified differences in vision, and the harmony heard on records often contrasted with the complexity of personalities behind the scenes. Some remember unity forged through shared struggle, while others describe a delicate balance that could shift at any moment, depending on finances, creative direction, or personal priorities. Frankie Valli's falsetto, unchanged in spirit even as decades pass, became the thread tying everything together, but it also intensified questions about authorship and ownership. Was a legacy built collectively, or did one voice naturally become the centerpiece around which everything revolved? As years passed and musical tastes evolved, the group adapted repeatedly, sometimes reinventing itself, sometimes leaning on nostalgia, and each reinvention blurred the line between continuity and transformation. Fans embraced the familiar sound, yet historians noticed the subtle shifts, the changing faces, and the evolving structure that made the story increasingly difficult to define in simple terms. Personal hardships and professional challenges laid additional depth onto the narrative, reminding observers that behind the polished performances were individuals navigating life's unpredictability, balancing fame with responsibility, and carrying memories that didn't always align. Interviews conducted years apart often revealed differences in tone, emphasis, and interpretation, not necessarily contradicting each other outright, but creating mosaic of perspectives that never quite merge into a single picture. Meanwhile, Valli's continued presence on stage at 91 add another dimension, a living connection to a past that refuses to settle into nostalgia alone, because his performances suggest endurance, but they also raise quiet questions about what remains unsaid. The applause is loud, the melodies timeless, yet the sense of unfinished business lingers, as if the story is still evolving even now. Perhaps that's why it captivates audiences across generations, not just because of the music, but because it reflects the complexity of collaboration, the cost of ambition, and the reality that success often leaves behind unanswered questions. As listeners revisit those songs, they don't just hear harmony,